After exceeding expectations and beating back the onslaught of a trained and armed militia, a troop of amateur gladiators received a standing ovation from the exhilarated crowds in the Colosseum in Rome. One man, who they call the Spaniard, seems to be their leader, but he wears a helmet that hides his identity. Stunned by his survival and impressed with his skills, the emperor, Commodus, now known to have brought the golden age of Rome to an end, descends into the amphitheater to meet this leading gladiator. Now face to face, the emperor asks him to remove his helmet and tell him his name, but instead, the Spaniard turns his back and walks away, which sends shockwaves all around the stadium. The expression on the emperor's face convulses from rage, and he demands that the gladiator obeys his command. He says, "How dare you show your back to me, slave? You will remove your helmet and tell me your name." And for what happens next, you'll have to watch. Gladiator, but the idea that turning your back on royalty is understood as a form of disrespect, even mutiny, is not an invention of Ridley Scott or Russell Crowe. For centuries, it was seen as a breach of etiquette approaching treachery to turn one's back to the king or queen in England, which meant that leaving the regal presence, one had to walk backwards in deference to either his or her majesty. In fact, it wasn't until 2009 that the royal protocol fell away due to fears that royal aides or guests might end up suing the crown if they got hurt walking backwards. And as it stands today, only 3 people remain obligated to exit in reverse when leaving the presence of King Charles, the Marshal of the Diplomatic Corps, the Monarch's Equerry, and the Lord Chancellor. And this deferential courtesy is not unfamiliar to anybody who's ever been in shul, even those who've never met a king or queen. And I would bet that at some point today, most of us performed this protocol because it is a key feature of our liturgy. Our sages legislate that at the end of our silent prayer, the Shemona Esrei, Tzarich she'afsia shalosh pesiot la'achorav, first we take 3 steps back. Va'achar kach yiten shalom, and only then do we bid farewell, do we give peace to God. And the context in which our sages discuss this practice of reverence in the Talmud is around the topic of how to exit majesty, defined in our tradition not by hereditary office, but by piety and sanctity. Our sages describe King Solomon departing Jerusalem backwards in deference to the divine presence which rests there, as some do today as they walk through the plaza of the Kotel backwards away from the wall. And in the same vein, our sages say, V'chein talmid haniftar me'rabo, so to a student departing their teacher, lo yachzir panav v'yelech, should not turn their back when they depart. And other than teachers and the temple, there is one other presence to which Jewish law mandates deference and expresses horror at the prospect of showing one's back, and that is the Torah scroll itself. In fact, the fact that this morning I stood at the podium with my back to a whole pack of Torah scrolls is a matter of deep controversy that leads to a legal ruling that ought to send shudders down my spine. The Shulchan Aruch, a text which has served as the most influential and instrumental code of Jewish law ever since the 15th century when it was written, states, Chayav Adam linhog kavod gadol b'sefer Torah. A person is obligated by law to exhibit immense awe before a Torah scroll, v'lo yachzor achorav, and not to show it one's back. To which the 16th century Polish jurist Rabbi David Halevi added quite helpfully, Nira de Rabbanim, it seems that rabbis who stand before the Aron Kodesh, einan bichlal isur zeh, are not in violation of this prohibition, he presumes. But as this exception granted to rabbis is only on the basis of a reasonable presumption, the 18th century Galician rabbi and banker Ephraim Zalman Margolis offers a stark warning. He says, rabbis who stand with their back to the Torah, relying on the fact that they are speaking in service of the Torah, need to be acutely aware of their responsibility, for if they fail to teach with integrity or permit even an iota of vanity to occupy their minds, they not only betray their pedagogic responsibility, but engage in impudent and impertinent profanity in his words. Ein lo toch. He has no substance. Ve'esh lo acharim, but he has his back. El heichal Hashem, to the ark of God. V'shomer nafsho yirchak mizeh, and one who cares for their soul ought to avoid such things. Standing with one's back towards symbols of heaven, the temple, teachers, and our sacred text is in Jewish law not simply the height of impoliteness or discourtesy, but a form of insubordination of the sort that made Commodus resort to violence, which makes me feel that on Shabbat morning perhaps I should be quiet and turn around and sit down, which leads us all to a rather striking moment in the text that we read in Shul this morning. The man who stands before our ancestors as the representative of heaven speaks to the people and seeks to inspire them to contribute towards the housing of God's presence. Moshe says, "Kachu me'etchem truma laHashem," take for yourselves a gift for God. Kol nadiv libo, all of you whose heart is moved. Excuse me. He then describes the vessels of the temple and the threads and the gems and the metals that they'll need, trying to inspire all the people to feel eager to be involved. As one commentator puts it, Hu amar lehem, he spoke to them, Kedei latet lev zeh lazeh, to try to stimulate them to inspire one another, V'to'oreh rucham lenitnadev, to arouse their souls, to contribute and volunteer. But as Moshe was ending his speech, the people do something utterly remarkable, something that happens nowhere else in the course of biblical history. V'yetzu kol adat b'nei Yisrael melifnei Moshe. The entire congregation walked away from Moshe's face. And a whole range of our commentators are aghast at the gall of all the people breaking the sacred protocol, seeming to stride away with their backs to their teacher's face. In the words of one commentator, kilkalaha shura, etiquette was breached. And this is our question. Why, in this moment, when Moshe was describing the Mishkan's components and appealing for donors, do our ancestors all turn their backs and walk away? And though there are a spectrum of perspectives, I'd like to share only one answer to our question with you today, and it is a view of the 16th century Syrian mystic Rabbi Mordechai HaKohen, author of the Siftei Kohen. And for him there is a single, simple reason that the entire people broke protocol and turned their backs as they walk away from the man who had their backs and saved their skin just last week. And they walk away before he had a chance to complete his speech. In the words of the Siftei Kohen, Heim Amru, they said, Ein anu tzrichim lazeh. We don't need this. They were so galvanized by the idea of the Mishkan in the wake of last week's amnesty that they didn't see the need for Moshe's speech. They already felt stirred and inspired, excited and fired up to contribute and participate and pitch in and consecrate sacred space to house the grace of their Creator. As our sages say on so many occasions, Ahavat hadavar kilkalaha shura, love can make us do crazy things. So, the people breached protocol without intending irreverence or disrespect due to enthusiasm that made their leader's speech redundant. Their discourtesy was a product not of insubordination to Moshe, but a deep devotion to God, and as Moshe was as far from Commodus as we can imagine, he let them go without denunciation or condemnation. He tolerated the sight of their backs, even if it meant that their deference to him was lax, because he knew that it was never about him, but heaven. And here the people's departure was driven by their reverence for heaven. And it seems the Buckingham's Palace termination of this particular protocol for fears of litigation was not misplaced, because our sages describe one student who took this etiquette a little too far. Rava, Kadhava Mifta Mineder Rav Yosef, when he would depart the presence of Rav Yosef, his teacher, who happened to be blind. Hava Aza La'ochrei, he would walk backwards. Ad de Minagfan Kare, until his legs became bruised. Umitavsan Athkufkata Tebe Rav Yosef Dama. Eventually the threshold of Rav Yosef's house was covered in blood. But being blind, Yosef had no idea that either his student or his home were being bloodied, and when witnesses told him, the Talmud cites him as saying to his student, Yehi Ra'ava, may it be God's will, Ditrom Reshach Akule Karka, that your head is raised over the whole city. Rav Yosef did not censure his student for his extreme courtesy, because he knew that beneath the etiquette lay the secret to a sacred society. What our sages saw, and what that blind sage saw, was that protocols around veneration in Jewish law are less about social hierarchy and more about instilling awe for moral truths that move us to live lives defined by a call to care for humanity. It was precisely a man who bruised himself out of deference to those who represent heaven's moral vision that our blind sage saw as the best to lead society, just as Moshe understood that as long as the nation was inspired by a veneration for divinity and driven by God's vision for a flourishing society, etiquette around human hierarchy can fall away. Where a Roman emperor felt personally betrayed by an enslaved gladiator who walked away, our tradition teaches that all reverence is ultimately not for kings or princes, but heaven, who calls us to heal all of humanity. So may we all find that same drive that inspired our distant parents to do what's right, and may our leaders bless our energy as a product of our divine summons to fill the world with dignity. I wish you all a Shavua Tov.